smoke, splintered trees, telephone wires hanging like broken veins across the earth. A Soviet infantry unit scrambled through the forest, searching for cover that no longer existed. The silence lasted only a heartbeat. Then it came. Not one explosion, not 10, dozens. A terrifying chorus ripped across the sky, growing louder with every second. Soldiers instinctively test themselves into the mud, but there was nowhere to hide. The air itself seemed to scream before the first rocket slammed into the ground. The earth erupted. Flames swallowed trenches. Supply wagons disappeared behind walls of smoke. Men shouted orders that vanished beneath a deafening roar no artillery battery had ever produced before. Those who survived would struggle to describe what they had heard. Some compared it to a church organ played by the devil. Others said it sounded as if the sky itself had cracked open. Across the front line, German troops froze in disbelief. Veteran soldiers who had endured months of relentless combat suddenly found themselves facing a weapon unlike anything in modern warfare. The barrage ended almost as suddenly as it had begun. Only burning earth remained. But the strange sound lingered in every survivor's memory. The Germans soon gave it a name: Stalin's organ. Yet the terrifying weapon that created that sound was never intended to fight a long war. It was born from desperation and almost never reached the battlefield at all. Summer 1941. Europe was collapsing beneath the weight of the largest invasion in history. Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, sending millions of soldiers, thousands of tanks, and endless columns of vehicles across the Soviet border. Entire Soviet divisions disappeared within days. Cities fell faster than anyone in Moscow had predicted. Railways clogged with refugees, retreating troops, and abandoned equipment stretched for hundreds of kilometers. Every report reaching the Kremlin carried the same grim message. The Red Army was losing ground. Factories deep inside the Soviet Union were being dismantled piece by piece and loaded onto trains before advancing German forces could capture them. Engineers worked beside laborers, racing against time to save entire industries while bombs fell around them. In those chaotic weeks, traditional artillery revealed a dangerous weakness. Heavy guns delivered tremendous firepower, but moving them across shattered roads required valuable trucks, trained crews, and precious time. Setting up a battery could take hours, time Soviet commanders simply no longer had. The front was changing faster than conventional artillery could respond. Something lighter, something faster, something capable of unleashing overwhelming destruction before disappearing again was no longer just an advantage. It was becoming a necessity. But nobody knew whether such a weapon could even exist. The Soviet Union faced more than a military crisis. It faced an industrial nightmare. Every tank, every artillery shell, every truck competed for the same limited steel, fuel, and factory capacity. Skilled workers had gone to the front. Entire production lines were being rebuilt, thousands of kilometers east of the Ural Mountains. Supplies arrived late, if they arrived at all. Even when artillery batteries reached the battlefield, they often lacked enough ammunition or transport to keep pace with rapidly shifting front lines. German doctrine exploited this weakness with brutal efficiency. Fast-moving armored spearheads punched through defenses before Soviet guns could reposition. By the time heavy artillery was ready to fire, the battle had often moved elsewhere. The Red Army needed more than accuracy. It needed shock, a weapon capable of overwhelming an enemy position in seconds. One that could appear without warning, unleash devastation across a wide area, and vanish before enemy counter-battery fire found its location. It was an unconventional idea. Many senior officers doubted it. Rocket artillery had existed in various forms for centuries, but military professionals largely dismissed it as inaccurate and unreliable compared with traditional guns. Why invest precious resources in weapons that scattered their fire instead of placing shells precisely on target? Yet a handful of Soviet engineers believed precision wasn't always the answer.
Sometimes fear, sometimes overwhelming volume, could become weapons of their own. What happened next would transform one of those overlooked theories into one of the most feared battlefield sounds of the Second World War. And the man helping turn that vision into reality was unlike the hardened generals leading the war. He was an engineer who believed that rockets could change everything. The engineer's name was Georgy Langemak, one of the Soviet Union's most brilliant rocket scientists. Alongside fellow innovators at the Reactive Scientific Research Institute, known simply as RNNI, he wasn't trying to build a weapon of terror. His original goal was far more ambitious: to unlock the military potential of rockets. Inside workshops filled with blueprints, steel tubes, and experimental propellants, engineers worked late into the night, chasing an idea many military commanders dismissed as impractical. Traditional artillery officers argued that rockets were wildly inaccurate. They burned too quickly, scattered unpredictably, and lacked the precision expected on a modern battlefield. To many generals, rockets belonged in laboratories, not wars. Yet Langemak and his team saw something different. A single rocket might miss its target, but dozens launched together could overwhelm an entire battlefield. Accuracy could be replaced by saturation. The idea was revolutionary, but convincing Soviet military leaders proved far more difficult than solving engineering problems. Then, everything changed. In the late 1930s, Stalin's Great Purge swept across the Soviet Union. Scientists, officers, and engineers disappeared overnight, accused of imaginary conspiracies. Langemak himself became one of the victims. Arrested by the NKVD on fabricated charges, he was tortured, forced into a false confession, and executed in January 1938. One of the very men responsible for creating the Soviet Union's future wonder weapon never lived to see it fire. His name was erased from official records for years, while others quietly continued the work he had helped begin. History almost forgot this moment, but the rockets did not disappear. Another engineer, Vladimir Artemyev, together with RNI designers and factory specialists, refined the rocket motors, while production teams searched for a practical launch system. Mounting dozens of rockets on a fixed platform seemed simple on paper. In reality, it created endless mechanical problems. Rockets had to ignite almost simultaneously. Launch rails needed to withstand enormous heat and vibration. The mounting system had to remain stable without becoming too heavy to move. Every test revealed another weakness. Some rockets veered wildly off course. Others exploded before leaving the rails. Propellant burned inconsistently, producing unpredictable ranges. Military observers watched these failures with growing skepticism. Government officials demanded results, while factories struggled to produce reliable components with limited materials. Yet the engineers refused to abandon the project. Instead of mounting the launcher on a heavy artillery carriage, they chose something unexpected: a standard Z6 truck. Suddenly, the entire concept changed. The launcher could race into position, unleash a devastating salvo in less than 20 seconds, and disappear before enemy artillery could calculate its location. It was no longer just a rocket launcher. It had become a new style of warfare. But one terrifying question remained unanswered. Could the truck survive firing 16 rockets almost simultaneously? During early trials, crews braced themselves behind cover as the first full salvo was prepared. The countdown echoed across the testing ground. Flames burst from every launch rail. Smoke engulfed the vehicle,
The ground trembled beneath an avalanche of rockets streaking toward the horizon.
For a few terrifying seconds, nobody could see whether the truck had survived. Then, as the smoke cleared, the launcher emerged almost untouched. The crew immediately started the engine, turned the vehicle around, and drove away.
Military observers stared in disbelief. The weapon had fired and escaped before a conventional artillery battery could even begin returning fire. That's when everything changed. Soviet commanders immediately recognized its greatest strength wasn't pinpoint accuracy. It was speed, mobility, and psychological shock.
Entire batteries could appear without warning, saturate an area with explosives, and vanish before the enemy understood what had happened. The weapon received the official designation BM-13, but very few soldiers ever called it that. On the battlefield, another name would soon eclipse every technical designation. A name born not in Soviet factories, but in the terrified reports of German troops who survived its first devastating attacks. What happened during that first combat mission would turn the BM-13 into one of the most feared weapons of the Second World War, and reveal why the haunting sound of its rockets became legendary across the Eastern Front.
July 14, 1941. Near the railway station at Orsha in Belarus, Captain Ivan Flerov and his experimental battery rolled quietly into position before dawn. The launchers were hidden beneath trees, their crews waiting in complete silence. German supply trains continued unloading ammunition in full, unaware that something entirely new was watching from the forest. Then the order finally came. Within seconds, 16 rockets screamed into the sky. More launchers followed, filling the air with an unearthly howl that echoed for miles. The station disappeared beneath waves of fire, shattered steel and exploding ammunition. Railway tracks twisted into useless ribbons. Trucks burned where they stood. Survivors later recalled that the attack seemed to arrive from everywhere at once. Before German artillery could respond, Flerov's battery had already packed up and vanished into the countryside. It was the first combat use of the BM-13, and it stunned both sides of the war. German intelligence struggled to understand what had happened. Reports described an entirely new weapon, capable of delivering the firepower of a large artillery battery in only a few seconds. The eerie sound of the rockets inspired German soldiers to nickname the launcher Stalin's organ, comparing the launch rails to the pipes of a church organ and the terrifying war to a twisted musical performance. The name spread across the Eastern Front faster than official military reports ever could. Yet this wasn't the biggest surprise. Soviet commanders quickly realized that the weapon's greatest strength wasn't destroying fortifications. It was breaking morale. Entire enemy formations abandoned positions simply because they feared another barrage was coming. Even experienced troops who had survived tanks, aircraft, and conventional artillery admitted that the psychological effect of a Katyusha attack was unlike anything they had experienced before. As production increased, hundreds of launchers rolled out of Soviet factories, mounted on trucks, tanks, and even Lend-Lease vehicles supplied by the Allies. They supported Soviet offensives at Moscow, Stalingrad, Kursk, and eventually Berlin, saturating enemy positions before infantry and armored units advanced. The Katyusha became one of the defining symbols of Soviet firepower. But hidden behind its success was a secret that remained unknown to most soldiers. The launcher itself was never highly accurate. Individual rockets often landed hundreds of meters from their intended aim point. Engineers knew this from the beginning. Instead of trying to eliminate the weakness, they embraced it. By launching dozens of rockets simultaneously, they transformed inaccuracy into overwhelming area destruction. It was a completely different philosophy from traditional artillery, and it would influence rocket warfare for generations. There was another secret as well.
Because the Katyusha was considered highly sensitive technology, crews received strict orders never to let a launcher fall into enemy hands. If capture became unavoidable, the vehicle had to be destroyed immediately. Captain Ivan Flerov's battery eventually faced exactly that situation later in 1941. Surrounded by advancing German forces and unable to escape, the crews detonated their own launchers rather than allow the enemy to study them. Many of the men were killed in the explosion, but the secret of the weapon remained protected. History almost lost the men who fired the first Katyusha, yet their sacrifice helped preserve one of the Soviet Union's most valuable wartime innovations. After the war, technology continued to evolve. Guided missiles, self-propelled artillery, and more advanced multiple rocket launch systems gradually replaced the original BM-13. Military planners demanded greater range, better accuracy, and faster reload times. The legendary launcher that had once terrified entire armies slowly disappeared from active service, but its influence never truly ended. Modern rocket artillery systems, from the Soviet BM-21 Grad to many contemporary multiple-launch rocket systems around the world, still follow the same battlefield principle first proven by the Katyusha: deliver overwhelming firepower in moments, relocate immediately, and deny the enemy any chance to respond. Today, restored Katyusha launchers stand quietly in museums and memorial parks across Eastern Europe. Their launch rails no longer glow with fire. Their engines no longer race across muddy battlefields. Yet anyone who understands their history can almost hear that unforgettable sound once more. A rising chorus that announced destruction long before the first rocket struck the Earth. The BM-13 eventually disappeared from the front lines, but the idea it unleashed never did. Every modern rocket barrage carries a faint echo of that summer morning near Orsha in 1941, when a weapon born from desperation rewrote the rules of artillery forever, leaving behind a sound that history would never forget.